It was the kind of October evening that felt stolen out of a memory: cold air, damp leaves sticking to the pavement, and the faint echo of children laughing somewhere deeper in the neighborhood. Andrew had been walking home from a friend's small Halloween get-together, his costume, an old leather jacket and a plastic mask, tucked under his arm. He lived only a few blocks away, and the streets were quieting down as porch lights went dark one by one. But as he passed Ridgemont Lane, the cul-de-sac notorious for its abandoned Victorian house, Andrew noticed something unusual: a dim, flickering light glowing in the window of the supposedly empty residence. That he slowed his steps, curiosity tugging harder than common sense. The house had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, after the last owner died under what locals only ever referred to as strange circumstances. No one went near it anymore. Kids dared each other on Halloween, but no one had ever seen anything inside. Yet there it was tonight, a faint orange glow, not like the steady hum of a bulb but more like candlelight, pulsing against the cracked and dusty glass. Andrew felt a chill crawl across his shoulders as though the wind had shifted, carrying something colder than the autumn air. He told himself it was just teenagers, probably lighting candles or messing around. But his legs carried him closer despite the unease prickling up his arms. The sagging gate creaked as he pushed it open, and he realized he hadn't heard any laughter or movement from inside, only that steady flicker of orange light, too controlled to be fire, too soft to be electricity. The wooden porch groaned under his weight, the boards bowing slightly as if the house were testing him, daring him to come further. He set his hand on the rusted door handle, half expecting it to resist, but it turned easily as though someone had been inside not long ago. The smell hit him first: stale wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic. He stepped into the living room where faded wallpaper peeled in long strips from the walls. Dust motes swirled in the air with every movement, and beneath the warped chandelier, the light source revealed itself: a single jack-o'-lantern, its carved face warped into a jagged grin. The flame inside it flickered weakly, casting shifting shadows across the room. But what unsettled Andrew wasn't the pumpkin, it was the fact that 3 more sat beside it, unlit, their lids off, hollow eyes staring straight at him. He froze, the silence so heavy that even the sound of his breathing felt intrusive. Then, almost imperceptibly, one of the unlit pumpkins shifted. It was subtle, as though it had simply settled into the floorboards, but Andrew's eyes caught it. The lid lay beside it, untouched, yet the carved face had changed. He could have sworn its mouth had been neutral when he first looked, but now the jagged teeth were twisted higher, like the grin had widened. Andrew's pulse hammered in his ears. He backed toward the door, every instinct telling him to leave, but the flame in the lit pumpkin surged suddenly, throwing a long shadow of his figure across the wall. And in that stretched, flickering silhouette, he saw something else move, something tall, thin, and standing just behind him. Andrew spun around, his chest tightening as though a fist had clamped around his lungs. But when his eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the jack-o'-lantern, the space behind him was empty, just the same peeling wallpaper, the warped staircase leading upward, and the dull gleam of broken picture frames leaning against the wall. His hands trembled, and he told himself it was a trick of the light, a nervous hallucination brought on by the pumpkin's flickering flame. Still, his instincts screamed that something wasn't right, that he wasn't as alone as the silence suggested. He took a shaky step backward, but the floorboard beneath his foot groaned loudly, echoing through the hollow house like a signal. The jack-o'-lantern's flame fluttered violently as if responding to the sound. For a moment, Andrew swore he heard a whisper rise out of the darkness, something soft and slithering, like breath carried across the room. He froze, his ears straining, and in that tense stillness, a second sound emerged, the faint scrape of wood, slow and deliberate, as if one of the other pumpkins were being dragged across the floor. His eyes shot down to the cluster of 3 unlit pumpkins. One had turned, ever so slightly, its hollow eyes now angled directly at him. His heart pounded against his ribs so hard it made his vision blur. Every rational part of him screamed to leave, to bolt for the door, but his legs felt rooted in place. The shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, flickering with each sputter of the candle flame, bending into strange shapes that seemed to twitch at the corners of his vision. He rubbed his eyes, desperate to ground himself in reality, and when he lowered his hands, his stomach dropped, because at the base of the staircase stood something tall. Too tall. Its head brushed the hanging chandelier, its limbs impossibly thin, arms dangling almost to the floor. There were no details in its form, no face, only a silhouette darker than the rest of the room, as if it absorbed the light itself. Andrew's breath hitched. The figure didn't move, didn't sway or step, it just stood there, waiting. He could feel it watching him, though no eyes were visible. The air grew heavier, pressing on his chest until each inhale felt like dragging gravel into his lungs. Forcing his body into motion, he stumbled toward the doorway, clutching the rusted handle. But the door that had swung open so easily minutes ago didn't budge. He yanked harder, his panic mounting as the wood groaned in protest. The whispering returned, louder now, weaving through the room like 100 voices murmuring at once. Behind him, a soft thud echoed, a sound of weight shifting against the floorboards. He dared a glance over his shoulder, just enough to see the jack-o'-lanterns had all ignited. Every one of them burned brightly, their carved mouths twisted into exaggerated, mocking grins. And standing between them, closer now, was the tall silhouette. Not at the stairs anymore. Not frozen in place. It was only a few feet away, its elongated fingers stretching toward him as though eager to close the distance. The flame nearest to it flared high, spilling light across its form, and for the first time, Andrew saw its head tilt slightly, curiously, like a predator savoring the fear it inspired before the strike. Andrew's pulse thundered as the shadow advanced, its unnatural height blotting out the faint glow of the jack-o'-lanterns. He yanked on the door handle until his knuckles burned, but the wood refused to give. In a last burst of desperate instinct, he spun and sprinted toward the staircase, reasoning that a second-floor window might provide an escape. The air grew colder as he passed the looming figure, the temperature dropping so suddenly that his breath puffed in sharp clouds. He didn't dare glance sideways, afraid that if he acknowledged it fully, he might lose what little courage he had left. The stairs wailed under his weight, each step echoing like a scream in the hollow house. The second floor was a long corridor stretching into shadows, its faded runner rug torn and curled at the edges. Picture frames, their glass shattered, lined the walls, though the images inside were so water-damaged they looked melted, faces smudged beyond recognition, as though time itself had erased them. Andrew's eyes darted from door to door, searching for an opening, a way out. But every knob he tried rattled uselessly, locked tight. His panic rose in waves, building with the certainty that he was being herded, not merely trapped. Behind him, the whispers had followed up the stairs, crawling across the ceiling like a swarm of insects. He stopped when he noticed a door at the far end of the hallway cracked open just slightly. Unlike the others, its hinges weren't rusted shut, and faint light seeped through the gap. But the glow wasn't natural, it had the same warm, pulsing flicker as the jack-o'-lanterns below. Andrew swallowed hard, his throat bone-dry, torn between the instinct to avoid it and the lack of any other options. The whispering grew louder, resolving into words he couldn't fully grasp, as if spoken in a language he should know but didn't. Each syllable clawed at the back of his mind, a sound that felt too familiar to ignore. With trembling hands, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, probably once a bedroom, but stripped bare of furniture. In the center sat another jack-o'-lantern, larger than the rest, its flame steady and tall. Around it, carved into the warped floorboards, was a circle of symbols Andrew didn't recognize, lines and spirals cut deep into the wood, dark stains seeping from the grooves. The pumpkin's face was different too. Instead of a crooked grin, its jagged mouth hung open as though screaming, eyes gouged into twisted shapes that made Andrew's stomach churn just to look at them. He stepped inside, but immediately regretted it. The door slammed shut behind him with a violent crack, and the light from the jack-o'-lantern swelled so brightly it nearly blinded him. Shadows warped across the walls, writhing like living things, forming faces that stretched and disappeared as quickly as they appeared. And in the glow, Andrew finally understood what the whispers had been circling toward all along. They weren't warning him. They were welcoming him. Andrew pressed his back against the door, his palms slick with sweat. No matter how hard he shoved, it wouldn't open. The wood felt as though it had fused to the frame. The jack-o'-lantern in the center of the room burned steadily, its carved scream frozen in a grotesque expression. He tried to avert his eyes, but the flames seemed to demand attention, pulling his gaze back every time he looked away. The circle of carved symbols glowed faintly, the deep grooves shimmering as if blood, not wood, ran through them. A strange vibration hummed beneath the floorboards, rising through his shoes, into his legs, until it felt like the entire house was breathing. The whispers, now distinct, wove themselves into his skull. They weren't merely sounds, they were thoughts that didn't belong to him, pressing into his mind like fingers pushing at a locked door. Stay. Belong. Ours. The words coiled around his senses until Andrew couldn't tell where his own fear ended and their commands began. He stumbled forward, nearly crossing the carved boundary, before stopping himself just inches from the circle. He didn't know why, but instinct screamed at him not to break its line. The air inside it shimmered, heavy, as if the space was reserved for something not yet present. His breath quickened when the jack-o'-lantern's flame stretched unnaturally tall, bending into shapes that weren't fire, elongated fingers, twisting faces, writhing shadows that clawed at the air. From the dark corners of the room, a sound rose, the groan of wood under massive weight. Andrew's eyes darted to the walls as the shadows bled outward, merging, thickening, until the outline of that tall figure reappeared. But here, inside this room, it was clearer, almost corporeal. Its limbs bent wrong, joints too sharp, head cocked unnaturally far to one side. The carved circle glowed brighter as the entity pressed against it, as if it were a barrier holding the thing at bay. The creature leaned forward, its faceless head tilting toward Andrew. Though it had no eyes, he felt pinned under its gaze. Its long fingers curled around the invisible wall of the circle, testing the barrier. Each scrape of its nails against the floor sent a jolt through Andrew's chest, like static electricity crawling under his skin. For one horrifying moment, he realized what the jack-o'-lantern was: not decoration, but a vessel, an anchor that held the thing here. The symbols weren't keeping it contained, they were summoning it, feeding it, strengthening it. The whispers were not random, they were instructions. The house wanted him to finish what had been started. Andrew backed away, desperate, clawing at the sealed door, but the wood didn't give. The whispers turned frantic now, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. Light them. Light them all. His head throbbed as the voices pounded against his skull, urging him to ignite the other pumpkins, to complete the ritual. The jack-o'-lantern's flame flared higher, casting the shadow being in full, monstrous detail. And then, with deliberate slowness, the figure pressed its head against the barrier, its featureless face flattening against the invisible wall, until thin cracks began to splinter through the glowing circle at its feet. Andrew's fingernails scraped against the door until splinters dug into his skin. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, each inhale tighter than the last. Behind him, the sound of splitting wood echoed, not from the door but from the floor. The circle's glowing carvings were fracturing, thin cracks radiating outward like veins. The tall figure pressed harder against the invisible barrier, its body twitching in unnatural jerks, limbs snapping back into place with grotesque pops. Every time its elongated fingers struck the edge of the circle, sparks of orange light burst upward, illuminating its faceless head in flashes. It wasn't simply waiting anymore. It was fighting to get out. The whispers now screamed inside Andrew's head, voices overlapping, urgent and commanding. Help. Finish. Light them all. He shook his head violently, trying to dispel them, but the pressure only grew. His vision swam, his ears rang, and for a second he thought he saw his own reflection in the pumpkin's flame, not as he was, but with hollow eyes and a stretched grin carved into his face. He stumbled back, hitting the wall, sliding down until he was crouched, his body trembling uncontrollably. It was no longer a matter of resisting curiosity. This thing wanted him, needed him, to complete whatever ritual had been set in motion. The jack-o'-lantern in the center flared so brightly it filled the entire room with orange light, and then, without warning, its lid snapped shut as if clamped by invisible hands. The flame vanished. Darkness swallowed the room instantly, thick and suffocating. Andrew's heart slammed in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, disoriented, the only light now coming from the faint glow of the fractured circle. But as his eyes adjusted, horror struck him. The shadow wasn't inside the circle anymore. It was at the edges of the room, spread across the walls and ceiling, stretching like a spider crawling into every corner. The barrier hadn't kept it in. It had kept it out. And Andrew was now inside its cage. He staggered toward the window, yanking at its frame, but the glass was cloudy with age, fused to the rotting wood. The whispers had turned to laughter, dry, hollow, as though a dozen voices mocked his desperation. The shadow coiled above him, forming fingers that traced along the ceiling beams, then slithered down the wall like black liquid. When he turned, the faceless figure loomed inches from him, its head tilted at a grotesque angle, long arms encircling him like bars of a prison. Andrew gasped, the air ripped from his lungs, as he realized he couldn't move, not because he was frozen with fear, but because the shadows themselves had begun to grip him, holding him in place. The laughter ceased. For the first time, there was silence. The shadow leaned closer, lowering its featureless face until it nearly touched his. A single phrase cut through the stillness, not whispered but spoken directly into his head with a clarity that made his skull ache. "You brought me here." Andrew's stomach dropped as he felt a searing heat burn into his chest, right where his heart hammered. His vision blurred, the walls bending around him, and before the darkness swallowed everything, he saw the jack-o'-lantern's eyes flare back to life, no longer carved, but real, blinking and watching him. When Andrew's eyes opened again, he wasn't sure if seconds or hours had passed. The room was different now, or maybe it wasn't. The jack-o'-lantern still sat at the center, but the symbols carved into the floor had shifted. Where once they had been spirals and jagged lines, they now resembled something else: hands, hundreds of them, carved palm up into the wood as if grasping for whoever stood above them. The air shimmered like heat rising from asphalt, though the temperature was freezing, each breath crystallizing in the dim glow. Andrew staggered to his feet, gripping the wall to steady himself, his mind buzzing with static. He couldn't remember why he had come inside in the first place. The whispers returned, but this time, they weren't coming from outside his head, they were his own voice. Dozens of versions of him spoke at once, overlapping, muttering phrases he didn't remember saying. "Don't run. Don't fight. You belong here." He clutched his ears, but the sound was inside his skull, vibrating through his bones. When he looked at the jack-o'-lantern again, he saw himself reflected in its flickering light. Only it wasn't his current self. It was him as a child, 8 years old, the age when he first heard stories about the Ridgemont house, the age he had walked past it on a dare and sworn he'd never step foot inside. The reflection's carved grin widened, and Andrew stumbled back in terror. The walls around him had changed, too. The faded wallpaper was gone, replaced with jagged carvings that matched the symbols on the floor, glowing faintly as if lit from within. They pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, faster and faster, until he couldn't tell if it was his chest or the house itself pounding. The floorboards rippled under his shoes, swelling and sinking as though breathing beneath his weight. His vision blurred, edges of the room melting into endless corridors that didn't exist seconds before. Every time he blinked, the space rearranged itself. The window was gone, then back, then twisted into a tall, narrow mirror showing his reflection standing closer than he really was. The shadow being's voice replaced the whispers, deep and resonant, no longer fragmented but whole. "You already chose this," it said, though its faceless form loomed nowhere to be seen. "You stepped inside. You gave yourself to us." Andrew's hands trembled as he reached for the mirror, half believing it was the only way out. But the reflection didn't mimic him. It raised its hand a second later, lagging behind, then tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, in the same grotesque angle as the entity he had seen before. His reflection smiled, jagged and sharp, and placed its palm flat against the glass. A thin crack formed beneath Andrew's own hand as if the mirror wanted to open, not outward, but inward. The glass splintered, the crack spreading like a spiderweb, and a cold draft swept through the room. The reflection's eyes turned black, its mouth stretching wider than any human jaw should allow. Andrew stumbled backward, but the reflection pressed harder, its hand now pushing through the surface of the mirror as though it were water. The glass rippled, sagging outward, and a single long, skeletal arm emerged, dripping with darkness, reaching for him. The house groaned violently as if it were delighted, and Andrew realized with a sickening certainty, he wasn't trapped with the entity. The entity was trying to replace him. The mirror bulged outward like a membrane ready to burst, its surface rippling with every movement of the skeletal arm. Andrew's breath hitched as the reflection dragged itself closer, inch by inch, its grin never faltering. The sound of splintering glass filled the room, sharp and brittle, but no shards fell, only black liquid dripping from the cracks, pooling at Andrew's feet. His shoes stuck to the floor, glued by the oozing substance, and panic surged through him. He yanked one foot free with a wet snap, but the other refused to move, pinned by the creeping tar-like shadow that spread from the mirror. The figure in the glass stepped forward fully now, its body peeling free of the reflection. It was Andrew, or at least, a version of him. Its eyes were hollow sockets, dark and endless, and its grin stretched so wide it cut across its face like a wound. It tilted its head the same way the shadow being had, twitching unnaturally with every movement. Andrew's stomach twisted at the sight, his mind rebelling against the impossibility of it. He tried to speak, to demand what it was, but the words caught in his throat. The thing only mirrored his silence, mocking him, until it whispered in his exact voice, "You're already mine." The shadow Andrew lunged, its skeletal hand snapping shut around his wrist. The touch was ice-cold, searing through his skin like frostbite. Pain shot up his arm as the thing pulled him toward the mirror, the surface warping wider, trying to swallow him whole. He dug his nails into the floorboards with his free hand, splinters tearing under his fingertips, but his body slid inch by inch toward the glass. His reflection's hollow eyes burned into him, and Andrew realized the whispers hadn't been trying to make him light the pumpkins, they had been grooming him for this moment, a willing vessel, a replacement. The jack-o'-lantern's flame roared behind him, casting erratic shadows that danced across the warped walls. For a split second, Andrew thought he saw other faces in the shadows, men, women, children, each with the same hollow eyes and grins, each watching silently as though bearing witness to his turn. Their presence pressed into his mind, urging surrender, promising release from the terror if he would just let go. His muscles weakened, his grip faltering on the floor. For one dizzying moment, he almost believed them, but then he heard something faint, so faint he wasn't sure it was real. A sound beyond the whispers, beyond the laughter. His own name. Spoken not in malice, but in desperation. A voice from outside the house, calling through the storm of shadows. It jolted him like a spark, snapping his focus back. Andrew snarled through clenched teeth, driving his knee upward into the reflection's chest. The figure recoiled, not with pain but with a guttural hiss that rattled the glass. The grip on his wrist loosened just enough for him to tear free, staggering back across the room. The mirror shuddered violently, cracks racing across its surface as the reflection clawed at the edges, shrieking in fury. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Andrew realized he wasn't entirely alone. Andrew staggered back against the wall, clutching his wrist where the doppelganger had gripped him. The skin was pale and mottled, as though frostbite had already begun to spread beneath the surface. The mirror rippled violently, the figure inside slamming its hands against the cracked glass, each impact sending jagged lines deeper through its surface. It wasn't gone, it was waiting for another chance to pull him in. Andrew's head throbbed, the whispers clawing harder at his mind, but then he heard it again, his name. Soft, distant, but real. Andrew. The voice sliced through the house's chorus like a knife. He turned toward the sound. It seemed to come from beyond the boarded-up window, muffled but urgent. Pressing closer, he strained to hear. "Andrew, can you hear me? Get out of there." His chest tightened with recognition. It was Claire, his sister. The rational part of his mind screamed it was impossible. Claire was supposed to be out of town, hours away. Yet the voice carried the exact cadence of her plea, trembling with fear. For a moment, Andrew's terror ebbed, replaced with desperate relief. But then the doubt crept in. Could it be another trick? Another voice borrowed by the thing inside the house? The mirror hissed violently, as if angered by the interruption. The reflection slammed its head against the glass, shattering it further, black liquid spilling across the warped floor. Andrew flinched but held his ground, focusing on Claire's voice like a lifeline. He shouted back hoarsely, his voice cracking from strain, "Claire! I'm here. Don't come in, it's not safe." His words echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the warped walls and returning to him in twisted versions of his own voice. Some repeated, "Don't come in," while others mocked, "It's not safe," each tone dripping with malice. From outside, Claire's voice grew louder, more insistent. "The door, Andrew. Get to the door now." Her words were punctuated by pounding sounds, heavy strikes against the front entrance downstairs. For the first time since stepping inside, Andrew felt the weight of the house shift, not toward him, but toward resisting her. The whispers flared into a frenzy, overlapping into one relentless command: "Stay. Stay. Stay." The jack-o'-lantern's flame rose higher, scorching the ceiling, and the carved faces in the shadows snarled in unison. The house didn't want him to leave. Andrew's resolve hardened. Whether the voice was truly Claire's or not, it was his only chance. He tore his gaze away from the mirror just as the doppelganger lunged again, its skeletal arm thrusting half out of the glass, fingers snapping inches from his throat. Andrew ducked and sprinted toward the door, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. The wood pulsed under his touch, warm and alive, resisting his grip like muscle rather than timber. Behind him, the shriek of the reflection echoed through the room, followed by the shattering sound of glass collapsing. He didn't dare look back, he knew it was free. Andrew threw his weight against the upstairs door, every muscle straining as the warped wood throbbed beneath his palms. The house groaned in protest, as though alive, each board flexing like tendons refusing to tear. Behind him, the mirror exploded outward in a rain of black liquid that hissed and smoked when it hit the floor. His doppelganger spilled fully into the room now, dragging itself forward on skeletal limbs, its hollow eyes burning like coals. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, each one urging him to stay, to surrender. His head pounded, blood rushing to his ears, but Claire's voice cut through again, "Andrew. The stairs. Run." The door finally gave with a splintering crack, flinging him into the hallway. He stumbled and ran, the floorboards trembling beneath him as though something enormous crawled within the walls. The wallpaper peeled upward like skin, revealing dark, pulsating wood beneath. Portrait frames swung violently on the walls, their glass shattering as he sprinted past. From the room behind him came the sickening sound of long claws raking against the floor, the doppelganger scraping forward, fast and relentless. Andrew thundered down the staircase, nearly falling as the steps warped beneath his weight, bending as though trying to swallow his feet whole. At the bottom of the stairs, the front door pulsed with orange light, as though the jack-o'-lanterns outside were alive and burning brighter than ever. Each slam from the other side echoed like thunder, the frame splintering with every blow. "Andrew!" Claire's voice screamed. He felt hope surge again, but it was laced with dread. Her voice was clearer now, but oddly hollow, as if it carried no breath behind it. He reached for the handle, gripping it tightly, but as he did, the shadows at the edges of the foyer thickened, coiling upward into long, bony shapes. Fingers. Dozens of them. The house itself was reaching for him. One slammed across his chest, knocking the air from his lungs and sending him sprawling onto the floor. He gasped, clawing at the boards as another shadow hand wrapped around his ankle and dragged him back toward the stairs. The whispers now shouted in unison, a single phrase over and over: "Stay. Stay. Stay." He kicked violently, his heels smashing into something solid, and for the first time, the hand recoiled. Andrew scrambled forward, ripping free just as another strike against the door tore the wood inward, splinters flying into the air. Light poured through the crack, searing and golden, so different from the flickering orange glow of the jack-o'-lanterns. For a brief moment, the whispers faltered. Andrew lunged for the opening, his fingers scraping against the shattered wood, when the doppelganger finally descended the staircase. It moved with unnatural speed, joints snapping, body bending at wrong angles as it shrieked in his voice, "Don't leave me." The sound froze him for half a second, a horrible, instinctive pause as if part of him believed it was real. The entity's long fingers reached for his back, brushing his shirt. With one last surge of strength, Andrew hurled himself at the crack in the door just as the frame gave way completely. He spilled out onto the porch, gasping in the night air, only to freeze again when he looked up. Andrew stumbled onto the porch, collapsing hard against the rotting boards as the golden light bathed him. The sudden silence was deafening. The whispers that had filled his head were gone, cut clean away as if someone had severed a wire. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, each inhale burning his lungs, but the air was real, cool, sharp, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves. For the first time since stepping into that house, he felt free. Behind him, the doorframe buckled and twisted, the doppelganger howling as its form disintegrated in the light. Its hollow eyes glowed brighter for one final instant before shattering into nothing. The door slammed shut with a thunderous crack, the sound echoing through the woods. Andrew lay still, dizzy with relief, until he heard it again, "Andrew." He lifted his head. Standing at the edge of the yard was Claire, or something that looked exactly like her. She was pale in the moonlight, her face half shadowed by branches, but her voice carried that same trembling fear he'd heard inside. "You're safe now. Come with me." For a moment, his body ached to run into her arms, to accept the safety he craved. But then he noticed the details, the way her feet didn't disturb the leaves on the ground, the way her eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's. He froze, horror pressing back down on his chest. The figure stepped forward, stretching out its hand. The woods behind it seemed to bend unnaturally, as though the trees themselves leaned closer to listen. Andrew's heart hammered. He could run to her and risk being dragged into another trap, or stay near the porch and risk the house reclaiming him. Every instinct screamed that he was still standing on a threshold, that he hadn't truly escaped yet. He clenched his fists, forcing his legs to move. Not toward the figure, but past it. Toward the dirt path that led away from the property, away from everything. The creature, whatever it was, let out a sound that was neither his sister's voice nor entirely inhuman, something caught between a scream and a laugh. The trees shook violently as he pushed himself down the path, stumbling, half running, half falling. He didn't look back again. He couldn't. The wood seemed endless, stretching into shadows that threatened to swallow him, but at last, the distant glow of a streetlight flickered through the branches. When his feet hit the cracked asphalt of the road, the forest fell silent behind him, as if whatever lived there could not cross beyond its boundary. Andrew collapsed onto the pavement, staring up at the sky. The stars shone clear above him, undisturbed, eternal. For the first time in hours, or maybe forever, he felt something close to peace. Yet in the back of his mind, a cold truth lingered: the house had not been destroyed, only denied. Somewhere in those woods, it still stood, patient, waiting for the next lost soul to step inside. And maybe, just maybe, it still had his sister's voice, calling out from behind its boarded windows, ready to lure someone else through the door.